Welcome to another episode of the Apex Perspective podcast. Today, I get the absolute pleasure to sit down with Rajvir Madan, who is currently the CDIO and CIO at Arcutis Biotherapeutics. Now, Raj, can we get started with really about the state of leadership today? We're seeing a wave of change in C-suite leadership, and one in particular that's a good one to bring up is the CEO of Coca-Cola. James Quincey has stepped down as CEO after quite some time, and it's due to the fact that the board and the company has an interest in making the company go towards an AI-driven route. So the important question here is, what do you think that's actually telling us about the state of specific leadership today?
Yeah, so Aryan, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here with you today. I know you're a student, and I appreciate your passion for bringing leaders like myself into the mix. So kudos to you for doing that. Now, coming back to your question, the way I think about it is that we are not going through a normal leadership cycle. The individuals at Coca-Cola, there's other individuals in the C-suite at companies like Adobe and Walmart that have really built successful companies, and the boards at those companies are still showing them the door. And that should make you stop and ask why that is happening. And what I think it signals, at least in my opinion, is that the skills that got you to the C-suite are no longer enough to keep you there. We've now entered into a moment where transformation isn't something that you do every 5 years. It's just a permanent condition. And a lot of these leaders aren't bad leaders. They were just shaped by a different version of the challenge than the one that's sitting in front of them right now. And I think the other thing we really have to think about is that what really is hitting organizations from both ends at once is that on one hand, automation and AI are reshaping the workforce from the bottom up, and then boards are replacing leadership from the top down. And I think that's a genuinely new dynamic, and most organizations aren't built to absorb that shock that's coming from both directions.
So then let's talk about that automation and AI you were just speaking about. Due to this pace of AI, there is going to be a compression in regards to decision making when it comes to these companies dramatically, essentially. So what allows leadership, from my understanding, to really keep up with this kind of pace is a degree of risk. So what do you think that leadership risk is that maybe individuals are not talking about yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I would say is that AI accelerates decisions faster than organizations actually have the ability to absorb the consequences of them. So the window where a leader can stop and ask, okay, what happens after this decision is made, is actually shrinking. And we've already seen major AI companies, for instance, where their core code and models have been leaked out into the open because of how fast they're moving. And I think that's an early warning sign of what happens when you move faster than the guardrails you built around yourself allow you to do. The same thing is happening inside companies as well, just quietly and out of the headlines, let's say. And here's the thing that doesn't get said enough. I think AI creates a false sense of rigor. A model spits out a confident-looking answer, and that confidence gets imported directly into a decision without anyone asking what the model didn't account for. Asking harder questions doesn't get automated. That has to be a leadership habit that we have to continue to instill in ourselves as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. So Raj, you are actually focused on digital transformation. And if you see the numbers on the successful digital transformation, I believe there's around 2/3 of efforts that actually fall short, which means only 30% are actually successful. So this has been the case for decades. What do you think is the read on why that number won't move?
So yeah, and Aryan, I would say that number sometimes is even as high as only 25% of transformations actually delivering the results that they're supposed to deliver. And I think this is happening because most organizations keep investing in better decision making, whereas the actual problem is better outcomes and how do you get to better outcomes. So what I have seen is I've seen a lot of management literature, leadership literature, frameworks, even technology put in place that helps you get to better decision making. But there is this space between when a decision gets made and when a decision lands on real people that leaders don't often get trained on and they don't often obsess about. So leaders obsess and get trained on how to make a better decision, but they don't often obsess on how to even deliver better outcomes. So that is something that I call the decision outcome divide, where instead of obsessing more on making better decisions, how do you obsess more on closing the divide between that decision and the intended outcome that you're looking to get to? Now, one of the other things that I keep thinking about is that a lot of cultural systems, a lot of cultural conditions, let's say, keep focusing on things that essentially ensure that you are making the best decision, but not ultimately resulting in the best outcome. So there's things like optimism bias. There's things like incentives that actually focus on how can we make the best decision, but not really focus on how you get to the best outcome. So those are things that we have to continue to think about as leaders, which is how do we reward how do we reward transformation based on the actual adoption or the actual results or the actual impact versus how do we reward decisions that ultimately don't result in the outcomes that you want them to get to?
Well, Raj, we're still seeing that around 66 to 67% of these programs are still not succeeding. So what do you think is being consistently underestimated in these transformation programs?
Yeah, so Aryan, for me, it's culture almost every single time. And I want to be really specific about this because when people hear culture, they think it's the soft stuff. It's actually not. Culture is the mechanism. It's the underlying infrastructure. You can restructure your teams. You can change your ways of working. You can move to a new system. You can redesign every process. But if the underlying culture doesn't shift, none of it actually sticks. Driving a transformation without addressing the underlying culture is like installing new software on a corrupted operating system. And if you do not think enough about your culture and how your decisions are going to ultimately end up landing on people, you do not think about the second and third order effects that your decisions are going to have. And I've seen this sort of play out over and over again. There's examples from various companies that, for instance, during the pandemic, you can think about where Walmart actually shortened some of its store hours to cut costs. But what that ended up doing was because they did not think about the second and third order effects, you ended up seeing a lot of crowding in the aisles. You ended up seeing staff that was actually overtaxed and overburdened, for instance, right? So you have to really think about what those second and third order effects are and ultimately how a decision that you make is going to land on the people that are actually impacted by those decisions and how they are going to take those decisions and what the ripple effects are going to be on them, because that's really important for you to think about as you think about any transformation program.
So right now you've been drawing a distinction between organizations that want the transformation and the ones that actually are committed to making it happen. So what do you think the gap between those two are?
Yeah, for me, the gap is language. And I think language gives it away almost immediately. So organizations, and I've seen this in a few instances previously, organizations that are running on a desire to actually deliver on a transformation use language like there will be bumps along the way. Let's not dwell on the negative. Come to me with solutions instead of problems. We'll get through this. That for me always sounds like you're substituting optimism for accountability and thinking through how your transformation is actually going to land when it gets in the hands of people that are going to experience that transformation. So that for me is one of the clearest signals, is really around that language. And I think how leaders speak, and whether they're being overly optimistic, I think for me is often a signal about whether they're committed to it or whether they actually are just using fancy language to communicate the transformation. So one of the other things besides language that I sort of think about is whether psychological safety actually exists or not. So if no one in the room is genuinely asking what could go wrong here, I think that should really be troubling for a leader, because that means that you're not really thinking about what the ripple effects of the decision are going to be. You're really only thinking about making that decision and spending all of your energy communicating that decision, as opposed to really thinking about how that decision is going to land and what outcomes it's actually going to generate on the individuals that experience that decision.
So if the old model is broken, and if we're wanting to actually consolidate everything we've been talking about, what would a more successful model when it comes to these transformation programs look like?
Yeah, so for me, it starts with one question that almost never gets asked. Are we ready for what will come from this decision? Not, is this the right call? And I think there's a subtle but really important difference there, right? So instead of asking whether this is the right decision, you're asking, are we ready for what's going to come once this decision gets rolled out? And that question essentially gets you to think about what happens after the choice or the decision has been made. And that's when you start to think about how the real world, where culture, people, systems interact with the decision, are going to actually treat that decision and how that decision is going to land with them. So that I think is how you sort of move from this old model to the new model, which is asking questions that focus more on the outcome versus asking questions that focus more on whether you've made the right decision or not. And I've seen companies do that really well. I think one company that comes to mind that actually does that is a company called Spotify, which many of us use for streaming, let's say, music. And one of the things that Spotify did several years ago is that they made the shift from thinking about features that were shipped to the end user to actually thinking about what they call listener outcomes, right? So what they wanted to do was they were not interested in sort of just shipping a bunch of new technology and new features. What they were more interested in is really understanding what those features generated in terms of experience and outcomes for the end user. And they gathered that feedback and then they incorporated that into how they were developing their product and their software.
So if we're seeing the CEO of Coca-Cola step down after quite some time, particularly because the company wants to go towards an AI-driven route, and if this can happen to a CEO of an established company like this, what do you think is a question that every executive should be asking themselves that they're not doing so?
So in my opinion, I think most leaders are asking the question, are we moving fast enough? Are we making the right bet? And while that's an important question, I think the even more important question is, what are we setting in motion that we haven't thought through yet? And almost nobody is asking that question. So by asking that question, you really start to think about the second and third order consequences that any moves that you make today will have 6, 12, and 18 months down the road from now. And the conditions that we're operating in right now, whether it's geopolitical volatility, whether it's AI acceleration, whether it's workforce anxiety, whether it's eroding institutional trust, mean that the ripple effect of decisions actually travel farther and faster than they used to. So a decision that would have stayed contained maybe 3 years ago now has really, really wide consequences. And here's one of the things that I actually find really helpful is that we actually have better tools now that can help us ask those questions or ask this specific question about What are we setting in motion that we haven't thought through yet? I think AI itself can become a tool and an enabler to help you ask that question, or actually help you answer that question more specifically. So AI can help you test different model scenarios. It can help you pressure test assumptions. It can surface consequences before they become a crisis. So I think that capability exists, but I think we need to develop that leadership habit where we need to get into the discipline of asking that question more often than whether we're moving fast enough or are we making the right bet.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, Raj. So tell me a little bit more about your plans for this year, whether that'll be professionally or on the personal side.
Yeah, so I think professionally, I continue to think about AI and the impact that AI is going to have on leadership and on the workforce, and how it's going to evolve the leadership skills that we need, as individuals going forward. On the personal front, I continue to invest more and more in taking care of my health. So a topic that I know you're quite passionate about. So for me, that's really about, I've actually finished 2 virtual challenges this year. I'm in the midst of my 3rd virtual challenge where, I try to do a certain number of steps every week. And then, as a reward, they send me a nice little medal. But putting that incentive sort of aside, I think for me, it's really important that I, continue to take more and more care of my health. And there's no better way to do it than actually walking. The weather is getting even better outside these days. So that's been a personal commitment that I've made to myself.
And I could agree more. The stat count is actually what I was using to lose my 70 pounds and obviously be able to retain that weight off. So I really appreciate that perspective. So I'm going to make sure to tag your LinkedIn down below, but is there any other place that you would prefer that people can reach out to you or learn more about you?
Yeah, I mean, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want to learn more about me, and feel free to join me on LinkedIn. I have started to post quite a bit about my leadership thinking and how leadership capabilities are evolving as we enter into this AI era. So feel free to join me on that journey as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me, Raj. This was Aryan Mohindra and Rajvir